Thanks, folks. Thanks for joining us today. We have an exciting topic to be covered called ISE Digital Certificate Administration. Without further much delay, we're going to go to our agenda. Here is what the agenda that we're going to cover in this session. Hopefully, at the end of this session, you're going to get the ISE certificate management architecture and what kind of or what different categories available in the ISE, such as system certificate, trusted certificate, ISE-Issued Certificate, we call it as internal certificate authority, operations and management around it, alarms and notifications, and what are the APIs available for us to do a certificate management. I try to actually describe it in a smaller sections over here, but there is a lot being covered. So let's get to our topic. Before even we get started on the certificates, let's get back to the basics. Let's first understand what exactly the digital certificate is and why do we even require a digital certificate first in place. A certificate is kind of an electronic document that identifies an individual, that represents an individual or a user, device, a person, entity, anything which is associated with a public key. In order to understand the requirement or why we require a digital certificate, we need to go back to the basics called PKI Infrastructure. Let's dive it through one use case where Bob wanted to send a confidential message to Mary, and he wanted to send that confidential message to Mary, and he wanted to Mary can only read that message. That's the purpose of it. Mary can actually leverage public and private key infrastructure to have this in place. So Mary is going to generate the public and private key, and whenever Bob wanted to send a confidential message to Mary, the public key, as the name itself indicates, that it can be published to anyone that is in communication. So she is going to send her public key to Bob, and upon receiving that public key, Bob is going to encrypt that message using the Mary's public key, and he's going to send that encrypted message back to Mary. Once upon receiving that encrypted message, Mary is going to make use of a private key, which is she was keeping as a private alone, to decrypt the message that she received in order to get the message back what Bob has sent. Well, Bob was able to indeed send a confidential message securely to Mary in this scenario. But there's something missing over here. How come Bob was able to identify the public key which was sent by Mary that proves her identity alone? There is somebody can pretend to be Mary and can send a public key to Bob, and he can accidentally send that confidential message to somebody else. That's where the public key infrastructure digital certificate is going to come into play. Instead of actually sending the public key straight away, Mary now can get the certificate with the details like her identity, username, or email address, or a phone number. Those kind of identity details are going to be imprinted in the certificate and can get a certificate signed by a certificate authority. This certificate authority is trusted, should be trusted, whoever was trying to communicate with her. And use a public key and a private key will also be associated with the certificate that she got it from the certificate authority. Now the same scenario, Bob wanted to send a confidential message back to Mary. How is he going to send her that message? Whenever Bob wanted to send that confidential message to Mary, during the initial connection, Mary is going to send her a certificate back to Bob instead of just sending the public key alone. So the public key is imprinted in the certificate itself and her identity details. Once upon receiving that certificate, Bob is going to verify the identity of Mary in the certificate. Then after, he's going to validate who has issued that certificate. Bob is going to validate the certificate authority, and he's going to validate against the certificate authority whether the certificate which was received from Mary was indeed good in state or not. Once the validation was successful and is trusted, he's going to make use of that public key imprinted in the certificate to encrypt the message that he wanted to send it back to Mary. Now he's going to send that encrypted message back to Mary, and Mary is going to make use of her private key to decrypt the message and in order to get back the message that Bob has sent. That's where the digital certificate is going to be useful for providing a secure communication and a confidentiality. In this example, we were trying to say that the Mary's identity was there in the digital certificate that she got it from the certificate authority. But in general, the digital certificate can represent not only a user, it can represent a device or a server or any entity which has to provide the protection and secure communication with. So the certificate in the broader terminology, we can categorize them into two types. One is called self-signed certificate, or second one is a digitally signed by an external entity, external certificate authority. Coming down to the self-signed certificate, it's signed by the entity itself. It's something like I'm proving myself that I'm Pawan. By default, whenever you bring up an application service or a server like an ISE, it is going to have the default self-signed certificate. It is considered to be less secure. The reason behind that is you're proving yourself that it is I'm Pawan. It's not the. But whereas in the digital signed by an external entity is something like you're giving your ID card provided by the government. So this certificate issued by the or signed by the certificate authority is can be used rather than signed by itself. And you can also make use of a certificate chaining for the flexibility. The chaining means you can make use of an intermediate certificate in order to have the flexibility. For example, if Cisco wanted to bring up all the applications with the certificate, they can make use of actually an intermediate CA. The intermediate CA can be signed by a well-known CA, and the intermediate CA can issue the certificate to different services and organization and business units. That's for flexibility. So the digitally signed certificate is going to be considered as more secure when compared with the self-signed certificate. Now that we understand what are the basics or the background behind the digital certificate and the usage part of it, let's get back to our topic called what exactly the ISE certificates are. Again, in the product terminology, we can categorize the ISE certificates into three categories called System Certificate, Trusted Certificate, ISE-Issued Certificates. Let's first understand what exactly the System Certificate, Trusted, and Issued Certificates are, the definition part of it and brief introduction part of it, and then we're going to dive into much more details along with the demo. So ISE System Certificate represents a specific ISE node and services associated with that node alone. It's specific to that node. It means it's not going to get replicated to all other nodes in your deployment. When the system certificates are specific to the node, what does it mean? Do I have to manage individual node system certificates separately by logging into each individual node? No. Fortunately, you can manage all the system certificates associated with each and every node in the deployment from the PPAN itself. Coming down to the second category called a trusted certificate, it's a list of repositories, it's a list of certificate authority that ISE has to trust with. The trust could be to different entities altogether. The certificate authority might be issuing certificates to the endpoints, which are going through the 802.1x certificate-based authentication, or the certificate authority might be issuing certificate to users for allowing them to access the admin UI, or the ISE when it is talking to the external entities such as feed servers, Azure Active Directory, LDAP servers, or any syslog servers on the secure channel. And for internal services like ISE to ISE communication. The certificate authority has to be trusted, first of all, in order to have the secure communication with the other entities that are in place. The moment you import a certificate authority into a trusted certificate store, it's going to get replicated to all the nodes. Coming down to the third category called ISE-Issued Certificates, it's an internal CA service that we're going to make use of it to issue the certificate to the endpoints. We're going to make use of the internal CA not only to issue the certificate to the endpoints going through the BYOD, we are also making use of the same service for issuing certificate to the services called ISE Messaging Service and pxGrid services. When you by default bring up an ISE, it's going to have a lot of aspects, a lot of services, admin service, EAP, radius DTLS, portal, SAML, pxGrid, whatnot. There are a lot of services and personas associated, aspects associated with that. All these services and individual node-specific functions are going to be associated with the default self-signed certificate. But however, in a production environment, we don't want to make use of a default self-signed certificate. We wanted to make use of a certificate signed by a certificate authority. The certificate authority might be your corporate CA or a well-known CA. We're going to dive into each individual aspect anyway in the later sections. How do I actually bring all these aspects or services into the three categories that we talked earlier? Simply put, administration, EAP, radius DTLS, portal, SAML, pxGrid are part of a system certificate, whereas ISE messaging service, pxGrid service, endpoint certificates are coming part of our ISE issued certificate. Now we come down to a first poll question. We wanted to get your opinion. What certificates do you use in your deployment? Are you making use of a self-signed certificate or a well-known certificate authority or a corporate CE? Remember, this is a multiple choice question. You might be making use of all the certificates, or you might be making use of some of them. Please provide your answer in the poll question. While you're answering that poll question, I'm going to go over to the next topic called ISE Certificate Architecture. This is what ISE certificate architecture is, and it's too much to grasp in one go. Let me help you to understand in detail. So let me wipe out the board and let me start from the scratch. Consider we have a PPAN, PSN, MNT, and pxGrid functions of an ISE node. Whenever an admin is talking or accessing an admin UI, that's when the admin certificate is going to come into play, or admin certificate is going to be used. Whenever admin is trying to use APIs for the operations purpose, that's when the admin certificate is also going to be used. When ISE was talking to external entities such as direct Active Directories, Azure Active Directory, or Freight servers, or even when it is talking to the other ISE nodes in the deployment, be it for the replication purpose, registration purpose, deregistration, manual sync purposes, that's when the admin certificate is going to come into the play. Whenever ISE nodes wanted to send a syslog message securely to secure syslog server, we need a secure communication to the syslog server. The syslog server might be having it must have a certificate issued by the certificate authority, or it can be a self-signed certificate also. But that certificate authority has to be trusted in all the ISE nodes in order to have a secure connection to the log server to send the syslogs to this secure syslog server. Coming down to the PSN function offers all the services to the endpoints. Most used function is portals. We have a lot of portals available in PSN, or we say ISE. The portals, sponsored, my devices portal, blocked list portal, etc. All these portals are making use of a portal certificates. The same PSN function was also allowing the users to authenticate over 802.1x. Whenever the endpoints are going through the 802.1x authentication, the EAP certificate is going to be used. Whenever network access devices wanted to send a radius request to ISE, radius DTLS is one of the secure communication in order to send that radius request using the radius DTLS certificate. So the radius DTLS certificate is going to come into play in order to secure the connection between the network access device and an ISE. When PSN was talking to the SAML servers, the SAML certificate is going to come into play in order to validate the SAML IDPs. The pxGrid function is used to integrate with the pxGrid controllers or ecosystem partners. You might be integrating your WSA FTDs with StealthWatch or a DNAC or a pxGrid cloud, whatever it is. The pxGrid certificate is going to actually come into play whenever you're making use of such kind of ecosystem partner integrations. Now, amongst the nodes, whenever they wanted to share the information, they share the information such as syslogs or the session information, posture information, or even a profiling information, we were making use of ISE messaging service. The ISE messaging service is the certificate issued from the ISE itself. It is for the internode communication purpose. So the ISE messaging service certificate is going to be used for having a secure communication amongst all the nodes. Simply gathering all these certificates, usage, services put together, we have this ISE certificate architecture. Hopefully that was made little simple with the animations. Then coming down to the ISE certificates, by default, when you are bringing up an ISE, you would have noticed that one single certificate is used for an admin purpose, EAP authentication purpose, radius DTLS purpose, and portal purposes. But however, you don't have to follow that. You can make use of a separate certificate for each and individual service. I can make use of a separate certificate for an admin purpose, separate certificate for EAP authentication purpose, separate certificate for every other service. The pxGrid and SAML certificate should be kept separate. The reason behind that is the pxGrid requires, apart from a server authentication, it also requires client authentication purpose to be enabled in the certificate. Usually when you compare with an admin EAP authentication radius DTLS, they will have a server authentication alone. But because pxGrid involves in the publisher and subscriber mode, it should have both server and client authentication to be enabled. Whereas SAML certificate should also be kept separate. The reason behind that is, in order to validate this SAML IDP, we require that SAML certificate to be kept separate. And from a security standpoint, it is better to actually keep the endpoints facing portals or endpoint facing services certificate separate from any other service. In case of a compromise or in case of any deviations or in case you wanted to renew it, you can always actually go ahead for your flexibility and security by keeping this end user services certificate separate. We come down to the second poll question. Before going with the second poll question, Rigo, what was the answer for first poll question?
Yeah, thank you, Pavan. Just as a reminder to everybody, the previous question was, what certs do you use in your deployment? And we actually have a tie for the top spot between well-known CA and corporate CA. And then this is followed by the third answer, self-signed cert.
Oh, that's a good one. Okay. So coming down to the second poll question, we wanted to get your opinion, which ISE services certificate are widely used in your deployment. By this, we wanted to understand what are the services that you are using the most. You might be making use of a portal certificates, ISE CA for issuing the endpoints, and pxGrid certificate and a SAML. Remember, this is also a multiple choice question. Please post your answers in the poll question. While you're answering that poll question, let me go ahead and for the next topic. Now that we understood what are the different categories available in the ISE certificates and ISE architecture is, let's dive into the details of each individual service and purpose. The first one, the ISE admin certificate usage or purpose. As I said earlier, whenever admin was trying to access ISE UI, be it PPAN UI, PSN UI, or an MNT UI, whatever, the admin certificate is going to be used for that communication. Whenever admin is trying to go with an API operations, that's when the admin certificate is also coming to the play. Whenever ISE is talking to the other ISE nodes in the deployment for registration, deregistration, manual sync, or even replication purposes, we're going to make use of an admin certificates. When ISE was talking to the external entities like feed servers, Azure Active Directory, LDAP servers, external syslog servers, we're going to make use of the admin certificate for this. Simply put, this is how the communication is going to be. But before even going into the deployment, let's first understand what happens during the registration. Initially, when you bring up an ISE, it is in the standalone mode. You might have to promote it to the PPAN in order to register the other nodes, right? So let's first understand from that beginning standpoint. Consider a scenario where I have a PPAN and I'm trying to register the standalone node called ISE2. Usually you'll go to the PPAN registration deployment page and you try to register by providing the ISE2 FQDN, ISE2 credentials. And then ISE gives back the ISE2 admin certificate back to the PPAN. Upon receiving that certificate, PPAN has to validate that certificate. It could be a default self-signed certificate. It could be a certificate signed by a certificate authority, or it could be a certificate authority might be even a well-known CA. In any case, ISE1, that means PPAN, has to trust that certificate. Especially when you are talking about registering a self-signed certificate node ISE2, the self-signed certificate is usually will not be there in the PPAN. Do I have to import the ISE2 certificate before even registration gonna happen? It was necessary long back, but it is not necessary now. With the easy registration process, admin is gonna be notified in order to import the ISE2 self-signed certificate. In case if ISE2 was making use of a certificate signed by authority, that authority should be there in your PPAN list so that it doesn't even actually notify you with anything. So once after the validation is over and is trusted, the PPAN and the ISE2 is going to have this secure connection between them. Over that secure connection, we're going to register the ISE2 with the personas that you have selected. And then we're going to transfer all the trusted certificate from the PPAN config DB back to the ISE2. And it's going to take some time for us to transfer the DB configuration and import that DB configuration into the ISE. It might take 10 minutes, around 10 minutes or so, in order to be in sync with the PPAN. So once after the sync is successful, the secure connection is going to be used for the replication purposes. This is where the admin certificates are going to be useful. We do have a demonstration in order to demo all these aspects. ISE admin certificate, basically, you need to make use of a certificate authority signed, a certificate signed by a certificate authority. As I mentioned earlier, system certificates are very specific to the node and admin certificate is also the same. It's not replicated, it's specific to the node. And you can also make use of a wildcard certificate if you wanted to import or use one single certificate for the admin purposes. Let's get into the demo where I was having a self-signed or default ISE, which I brought it newly. When I try to access the UI of that node, let's understand what's going to happen. So I have this ISE node which was brought up newly. So I'm trying to access the UI of that node. Because it is by default going to have the default self-signed certificate, the browser indicated me that the connection to the server is not secure. Because the self-signed certificate usually will not be available in your endpoints, browsers especially. So obviously the connection is not secure. Let's first understand the certificate is not valid. So if you notice that it is issued to and issued by the same entity, what does it mean? It means it's a self-signed certificate. You can also click on the details to find the same information like subject, issuer, details. Issuer and subject are one and the same over here, meaning that it is a self-signed certificate. But in the browser, you can add an exception or you can even proceed for the secure connection if you know that you're talking to that entity. So that's how basically the default self-signed certificate is going to come into play. But however, let's get into the second demo where I wanted to generate a certificate signed by a certificate authority for an admin purpose. How do I do that? Let's get into the demo of it. So I'm making use of the same ISE node, which I brought it up recently. It was making use of a self-signed certificate. Let's confirm that. Go to the administration and certificates page. And under system certificate, you could see that it is making use of a default signed server certificate. And it is used for not all the purposes like admin portal, APE authentication radius DTLS purpose. So we can go to this certificate signing request in order to generate a certificate signing request for this entity or for this node. You can generate the signing request for multi-purpose or for a single purpose. The single purpose, when I say I wanted to generate a CSR for my admin purpose alone, or I wanted to generate a certificate signing request for portal purpose alone, or DTLS purpose alone, or EAP authentication purpose alone. But if I wanted to make use of one single certificate for all the purposes, then I can make use of a multi-use. So you can choose a specific purpose or a multi-use, whatever you want. But for this demonstration, I'm going to make use of a multi-use. That means I can make use of this certificate signing request to generate a CSR, which is used for admin, EAP authentication, DTLS, and portal purposes. I can provide the subject, organization unit, state, country details, and then I can submit the request. The CSR was generated successfully. You can select the same CSR to view the CSR content. So copy the CSR content, CSR request. And I'm going ahead to the certificate authority. The certificate authority, let's download the certificate authority certificate itself first. Download it in the base64 format. And let's go back to the home page to generate a certificate based on the CSR that you have generated from the node. I'm going to make use of a web server template for the demonstration purpose. I'm submitting the request. So I got the certificate signed by the root CA. So I'm coming back to the ISE and I need to first import the certificate authority certificate before even binding the certificate signed by the CA. So I'm going to select the import option and select the certificate, provide the friendly name. That's my root CA. And I need to choose this certificate authority is used for what? Is it used for client authentication? Is it used for admin UI authentication? Or is it used for Cisco services? We're going to go into the details in detail little later also. But here we were trying to say that this root certificate is used for what? It is used for a client authentication purpose, UI purpose, or a admin UI authentication purpose, or even Cisco services purpose. Yes, I'm going to make use of this certificate authority for all the purposes. So I'm check checking all the boxes. Then I'm going back to the certificate signing request page and bind the certificate that I got it from the CA. So I'm going to select that, provide a friendly name. Remember, we generated this CSR with a multi-purpose, multi-usage. It means I can associate different services using this certificate. So I'm going to make use of this certificate for all the purposes except the pxGrid and ISE messaging service, and submit the request. So remember, whenever you try to change the admin certificate, it will go for a restart. But in other services, you don't have, it will not go through the application restart. So basically, that's how you're going to bind the certificate. So let's go ahead and talk about this third demo where I'm trying to register the secondary nodes. One was having a self-signed certificate, another one was issued by another one was having a certificate issued by the certificate authority. So first of all, let's go back to the same ISE node. I'm making use of this as a PPAN. I'm going to make use of this as a PPAN. So at this point of time, it is a standalone machine. And we know that we got one certificate signed by a CA, and we were making use of that certificate for the admin EAP authentication purpose. In order to register any node to the deployment, we need to first of all make it as a primary. So promote it to primary and submit the request. It was already made, now it is made primary. So now let's try to register another node. So I was trying to register node called ISE node 22.dominion.in, and I was trying to access that UI of it. Whenever I try to access the UI, it was clearly notifying that it is not secured and it is a self-signed certificate. You can get into the details of it. Sorry. You can get into the details by going through the details of the certificate also. So I'm gonna go ahead and register such kind of node where the default self-signed certificate is used. I'm providing the FQDN, credentials of that node for the authentication purpose. Click next. The moment PPAN is trying to register the secondary node, it notifies me that the registering node is having a self-signed certificate. You can clearly see that it was notifying that it is a self-signed certificate issued by and issued to is the one and the same, and you can import it before even having a secure connection. Once the registration, once the import was successful, then it goes for the registration details. You can select whatever the personas that you wanted to register with and submit the request. So once the registration is completed, I'm going to go back to the deployment page. Look at that, it is a registration pending state. If you go to the trusted certificate page and look for the ISE node 22, what we registered now, you can clearly see that the self-signed certificate was already imported into the trusted certificate list. Now let's try to register another node into the deployment, but here this time we're going to make use of a certificate signed by a CA, and that CA is already trusted in the PPAN trusted store. You can clearly see that it was already having a certificate signed by a certificate authority called Dominion CA, my root CA, and it was already imported earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and register such kind of a node. Provide the credentials, details of the FQDN, ISE FQDN details. Click next. Then it is not notifying me with anything because the certificate which was used by this node, ISE 23, it was already trusted in the PPAN. So I can go ahead and have a secure connection without notifying me itself. So I can select whatever the persona that I wanted to choose it and go for a registration. So that's how you can basically register the nodes using any self-signed certificate or a certificate given by the certificate authority. So that's how the admin certificates are going to come into the play whenever ISE nodes were talking to other ISE nodes in your deployment. Now that we came down to the third poll question, before going with the third one, Rico, what was the answer for the second one?
Yeah, thanks, Pavan. So for the previous question, we asked which ISE services certs are widely used in your deployment. And from what I see, portal certificates is the top choice for our audience. Then we have a good number of votes towards ISE CA for endpoint certificates, and then SAML.
Oh, that's anticipated. Okay. Our assumptions are actually aligned with your preference. Okay. So let's get into the third poll question. What would you prefer? Would you be preferring end user portal certificate different from an admin? Or would you be preferring certificate signed by a single CA? Or would you be preferring multiple CAs to issue certificate to different services? Or would you be preferring one single certificate, such as wildcard certificate for all these services? Remember, this is also multiple choice. There might be instances where you might be using one CA for all the purposes or one CA for different services or different CAs for different services. So let me know your opinion by answering the poll question. So while you're answering this poll question, let me go ahead and with the next topic called ISE EAP Certificate. As I said earlier, whenever the endpoints are going through the .1x authentication, that's when the EAP certificate is going to come into the play. Where is it exactly come into play? Well, let's go with the scenario. When endpoints are actually getting authenticated over .1x, the EAP communication is going to happen between the endpoint and the network access device. The network access device has to send the radius request to ISE, and it is going to encapsulate EAP request that it got from the endpoint in the radius request itself and send it to ISE. And ISE sends its EAP certificate back to the endpoint in order to provide the confidentiality, because we don't want endpoints to provide their credentials to the network access device. In order to have such kind of a confidentiality, we were trying to have an outer TLS tunnel. In order to have that outer layer TLS tunnel in the EAP authentication methods, we were making use of this EAP authentication certificate. In case if this EAP authentication certificate is self-signed, usually by default when you are bringing up an ISE, it's going to come with a default self-signed certificate. Usually this self-signed certificate is not going to be trusted in the endpoints. Fortunately, in Windows and Mac operating system, in some endpoints, you're going to get notified stating that, hey, it's getting connected to so and so ISE with this certificate. Do you want to proceed for the connection or not? But in some endpoints, you will not even see such kind of a notification. For the smoother experience, you should make use of a corporate CA or a well-known CA for the EAP authentication purpose. I see most of the people making use of a corporate CA for, especially for a .1x authentication purposes. So whenever the ISE, whenever endpoint submits the credentials, then based on the credential validation, it's going to go through the access accept or access reject. Access accept means it's authorized, the port is authorized, whereas access reject means the port is unauthorized. That's when the EAP certificate is going to come into play. Coming down to the other piece of under system certificate called portal certificate. We know we have a lot of portals being used in the ISE called guest portal, sponsor portal, BYOD portal, etc. All these portals are making use of a portal certificates. These are end user facing portals basically. You can make better from the security standpoint, better to keep these certificates different from the admin purpose. And can I make use of one certificate for all these portals, or can I make use of a different certificate for different portals? Yes, it is possible for you to make use of a different certificate for different portals altogether. Imagine the situation, I wanted to make use of one certificate for a post share purpose and another certificate for a guest purpose alone, just to differentiate from a employee versus guest users. I could make use of a different certificate altogether. But how many portals do I have? Can I manage all these portals? Yes. From the portal group tag, you can make use of this portal group tag in order to group multiple certificates, and that certificates can be used in the portal purposes. So you can create one portal group tag like this, add new, and then I generated two portal tags called guest CPP MDM and another one called sponsor and my devices. What I mean to say is I'm going to make use of this certificate for the sponsor and my devices portal purpose. But whereas this certificate I'm making use of for CPP MDM guest purposes. Where am I going to make use of this portal group tag? Well, you're going to go to that portals, uh, say for example guest portal, and I'm going to select the certificate group tag. This is where you are associating group tags so that the certificate versus portal is associated with. So let's understand from the services standpoint. We have two scenarios to talk about. I'm not going to talk all the services in ISE, but just to give you a glimpse of an idea how these certificates come into play, I'm going to go through two demonstrations. The first one, ISE guest portals. Whenever the guest endpoints come into the network, it's a map authentication request based on just a MAC address. It's going to get authenticated. Of course, we don't want to give full network access just based on the MAC address. So we're going to limit the authorization to the end user using the ACL and URL redirects. So the moment he tries to access any URL, the network access device is going to inspect that packet and it's going to notify that it has to be redirected. That's when the user is going to get redirected to the guest portal page. That's when the portal certificate is going to come into play. Remember, if you are making use of a default self-send certificate, because this use case is guest portal, usually, not usually, by default, none of your devices are going to actually trust the self-send certificate. We don't want that kind of a user experience to happen. Even if you're making use of your corporate CA for the portal certificate purposes, the corporate CA might not be found in your guest user devices. So it's better to use the well-known CA for especially the guest portal purposes. Now, once the guest credentials were given, then it's going to raise the COA to give the guest access to the user. So let's dive into the details of it by going through the demo. So I have an ISE over here. Let's go to the deployment and let's understand what my deployment is. I have a 5 node deployment and ISE node 25 is being used for my PSN function. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the system certificate, go to the ISE node 25, which is my PSN, and let's understand the certificate associated with it. I'm making use of two portals certificate. One is for sponsor and my devices purpose, another one for rest of the portal purposes, default portal certificates. Where did I associate these? Because this is a guest portal, I'm going to go into the guest portal. Self-registered guest portal is what I'm making use of for the demonstration purpose. Under the portal settings, you can clearly see that default certificate portal tag is being used. That means this portal is using the default portal certificate group tag certificate. So I'm going to go to the endpoint connected to the network, and it's already asking me to redirect to a login page. If you look at the details of the certificate given by this portal, it was issued by the corporate CA. Remember what I said? In case of a default self-send certificate or a corporate given certificate, it is usually not trusted in your guest devices. You cannot anticipate that all your corporate CA is going to present in all the guest devices. So it is better to use the well-known CA for the guest usage purpose. So once after providing the registration details, you can, sorry, once after providing the guest registration details, you can log in using the registered details. Now that it was successful, let's go back to the ISE and look at the live logs. So that's how the guest service is going to operate. Now let's try to understand another service called posture service. So when the posture service is especially used to posture the endpoints, especially the corporate devices. So the corporate devices, we usually ask them to connect securely over .1x authentication. So when the endpoint's connected with a .1x authentication, that's when the EAP certificate is going to come into play, and radius request is going to be forwarded to ISE. And ISE initially put him into the posture unknown state to limit the access that the user or device has. Whenever it tries to access any URL, it will be get redirected to the CPP portal page where he can download the client any connect. So this portal, client provisioning portal, is also making use of a portal certificate. Downloads the AnyConnect, and once the AnyConnect is downloaded and installed, the AnyConnect will also make use of the same portal for the secure communication. It's going to evaluate the posture policies and then gives a COA to give compliant or non-compliant access. Let's get into the demo of it. I'm making use of the same deployment. So I'm going into the endpoint. It got authenticated already over .1x, but it was saying that it has to be redirected to some page. So the browser was indicating me that there is a URL redirect. And this client provisioning portal, if you look at it, the connection is secure because I'm doing it on the corporate device. The corporate CA was already trusting this corporate CA. So ISE Node 25 was used as a PSN over here, and it was issued by the root CA. And that root CA was already trusted on the endpoint. That was the reason why you don't get any notification prompt from the browser standpoint. So you can download the AnyConnect. First of all, in order to download the AnyConnect, you need to download the Network Setup Assistant. The Network Setup Assistant is going to allow you to download the AnyConnect. When you run the Network Setup Assistant, it's clearly showing me that the connection is secure. It was already making use of a corporate CA for secure channel to download the AnyConnect. So the AnyConnect is going to get downloaded, gets installed onto the endpoint, and AnyConnect would automatically discover the ISE and it is in communication. Usually, if you were making use of a self-signed certificate, or if you are making use of a certificate which is not trusted in the endpoint, usually the AnyConnect, Network Setup Assistant, and browsers will always intimate you stating that the certificate authority is not trusted or default certificate is not available. So that's how basically the posture service. Let's come down to now that we have talked enough on the portal certificate, let's get into the other aspect of a DTLS certificate. As I said earlier, when the network access devices wanted to send a radius request to the ISE, it's going to make use of a DTLS certificate. The radius request can be sent over using a shared secret or a key page, or you might want to actually secure the radius communication between the network access device and ISE. The secure communication can be established using the radius DTLS, or you can also make use of an IPsec tunnel between the network access device and ISE. The easier one is actually radius DTLS, and that's when the radius DTLS certificate is going to come into the play. Tune into our next webinar topic that is upcoming next month for the extensive usage of the network access devices and their management. The SAML certificate is going to be used in order to validate the SAML IDPs. You can't actually club this SAML certificate with any other services. Coming down to the third category called ISE Trusted Certificate. The Trusted Certificate, when I say, it's basically second category. The ISE Trusted Certificate is kind of a list of repository that you're maintaining, list of certificate authorities that you're maintaining. It could be used for a client authentication purpose. It could be used for the admin authentication purpose, or whenever ISE was talking to external entities, that's when the certificate authorities is going to come into the play. The certificate authority might be issuing certificates to endpoints for .1x certificate-based authentication or a UI-based authentication, or even ISE was talking to external entities. That's when the certificate authorities is going to come into play. Those certificate authorities have to be trusted in ISE in order to have the secure connection. Whenever you're trying to import a certificate into the trusted certificate store, you have these choices. Remember these choices whenever we are trying to import the root CA, we need to ensure what is that certificate meant for. Let's imagine the situation. I'm making use of a corporate CA for my client authentication and syslog purposes and even admin authentication purpose. Then I'm supposed to actually check this box, trust for authentication within ISE, and check this box, especially when the corporate CA is being imported for the .1x authentication purpose. Even when you wanted to send a syslogs to secure over the secure channel to the external syslog server, that is when you need to check this box. Whenever you're trying to import a certificate authority into the trusted list, and that certificate authority has issued a certificate to the endpoint browsers for the admin UI authentication, that's when you need to check this box. When ISE was talking to the external entities, such as Azure Active Directory, Feed Server, Active Directory, or an LDAP server, or any other secure channel, that's when you're going to make use of the certificate authority. These certificate authorities has issued certificates to Azure, Feed Server, and Directory servers. Whenever you're trying to import that such kind of a certificate authority into trusted store, you need to check this box in order to have a secure connection to the external entities. We come down to the fourth and last question, poll question. Rico, what was the answer for the third poll question?
Yeah, thanks, Pavan. So for the poll question number 3, we actually have another tie. The top preferred choices based on the results here are end user portal cert different from the admin cert, and certs signed from single CA. The next popular one is multiple CA signed certs for different services, and then we also have some who prefer wildcard certificate.
Yeah, there are different purposes. Based on the requirement, you're going to make use of different certificate. Yeah, understand. So let's come down to the last poll question. ISE certificates, what is your opinion on the ISE certificates? Are they flexible and easy to manage? Is it hard for you to manage, but they are necessary? Are you facing any issues during the migration or operation purposes? Let us know your opinion. Remember, this is also multiple choice one. Please provide your answers in the poll question. Now, let's come down to the last category called ISE Issued Certificate. It's an internal CA which was issuing certificate to the endpoints and the services, as I said earlier. So before even we dive into the purpose and usage of it, we need to understand the certificate authority architecture from an ISE deployment standpoint. PPAN in your deployment is always becoming a root CA, and it issues an ISE node CA to itself and to SPAN. And SPAN node CA is going to issue endpoint sub-CA OSP CA. From the PPAN node CA, it's going to issue endpoint sub-CA OCSP CA to all other nodes. You might be wondering, why do I even require endpoint sub-CA when I'm talking about an SPAN, PSN, or a pxGrid functions? Of course, it's going to make sense for me to have an endpoint sub-CA on the PSN, but why is it even required on the pxGrid? Why is it even required on the MNT and SPAN? Remember, you can always enable at any point of a time the PSN function on any of these nodes. So if you do so, we don't want to generate that moment. We would be generating the endpoint sub-CA whenever you try to register a node to it. So from the endpoint sub-CA, ISE messaging services, ISE pxGrid certificate is being issued. And it is going to be used to issue certificate to the endpoints which are going through the BYOD. So whenever you onboard a endpoint through BYOD, it's going to get the certificate from endpoint Sub-CA from a PSN. This endpoint Sub-CA is issued by the node CA of a PPAN and node CA PPAN issued by the root CA. So that's how the, the chain of the endpoint is going to be. So in simply put, in the terminology, I try to actually describe in this way. So ISE messaging service is also making use of an endpoint Sub-CA. We were making use of ISE CA service to issue ISE messaging service certificate. Why do I even require ISE messaging service certificate? Because ISE messaging service is going to be used for sharing the session information, syslogs, or contextual session syslogs, and even posture and profiling information amongst the nodes. We need to make use of ISE messaging service. And ISE messaging services uses ISE messaging certificate. And ISE messaging certificate is issued from the endpoint Sub-CA. So let's first go through a demo by onboarding an endpoint. So I'm making use of one endpoint over here, and it got authenticated already on an open network. If you look at it clearly, I'm trying to onboard my personal device through BYOD. If you look at it initially, the personal device, when it is getting redirected to a guest page, it was clearly notifying that it is a PSN that it is talking to, and it was issued by the corporate CA. But the corporate CA is not going to be found in your personal devices. So that's the reason why the browser is going to notify that it is not trusted. But however, we wanted to actually proceed with that. It's a one-time duty for you to onboard the device. So I'm going to make use of my employee credentials in order to log in and onboard this device. During the onboarding process, the network setup assistant is going to get downloaded, through which we're going to onboard this device. This network setup assistant, when you run it, it's going to establish a secure connection to the PSN. So because the PSN was making use of a certificate which was issued by a CA, and that CA was not basically trusted in the endpoint so far because it is a personal device. So the network setup assistant was trying to import that certificate, install that certificate on your endpoint, and then look at this. It's basically issued by the corporate CA. And I wanted to install the profile as well. So that's how you basically, the network setup assistant is going to install the certificate required, and it's going to onboard the device. Once the onboarding is completed, let's see what the device certificate that I got. So if I open up my MMC, go to the personal certificate store, it was having a certificate issued from the endpoint Sub-CA. You can clearly see that the certificate was issued from endpoint Sub-CA. And you can see this was making use of a template. We're going to go through that template again. And if you look at the subject alternative name, instead of just making use of a MAC address, we're making use of a GUID of that device. This is to avoid the MAC randomization problem. So MAC randomization solution was already incorporated into 3.1. So, and it also enabled the .1x authentication profile, which was using the certificate. Now let's go back to the ISE, which is going to be interesting part of it. Let's go to the certificate authority. Let's look at the certificate template. Using this certificate template, we were issuing the certificate to the endpoints. So that's the reason why you see these details and these details when in the endpoint certificate. If you go to the issued certificate, you will be finding the certificate issued to the endpoint. And if you look at the details of it, it was issued by the endpoint sub-CA. Endpoint sub-CA was issued by the node CA, and node CA was issued by the root CA. So that's how the BYOD process is going to look like. That's how we are making use of ISE internal CA service to issue certificates to the endpoints as well as the services. Another service that it was using is a pxGrid certificate. So the pxGrid certificate is going to be used for a pxGrid ecosystem partner integration, especially when you're trying to integrate with the firewalls, FTDs, WSA, DNAC Center, any pxGrid subscriber. We're going to be making use of this pxGrid certificate. You can make use of a certificate authority, corporate CA, for these integration purpose also. So those are all three categories in detail that we talked about. Now coming down to the certificate management. Whenever you're trying to have a secure communication, you have to validate whether the certificate is holding good or not. The certificate might have been given by a certificate authority or your root CA or even well-known CA. But how do I even come to know that this certificate in communication is still valid? For that validation purpose, you're going to make use of an OCSP and a CRL. Imagine the situation you are trying to get authenticated using this certificate, and that certificate was issued by a corporate CA. ISE has to ask a corporate CA whether the certificate that you're bringing into the network, is it still valid? Using any of these two methods, OCSP and CRL, you're going to make use of actually validate the certificate. The basic difference between the CRL and an OCSP is the CRL, they're going to be retrieved from the CA and it's going to be there in the cache. So when the certificate is in communication, it's going to be validated against the cache of CRL's cache to validate the certificate. In case of a OCSP, ISE dynamically asks the CA service whether the certificate is in good shape or not. You might be getting a response from OCSP stating that it is good, revoked, or unknown. Good means the certificate is holding good. Revoked means the certificate authority might have revoked because of a compromise or for any other reasons. Unknown means it might be the OCSP itself has a communication problem, so you might get a OCSP response as an unknown. So you have to actually take a backup of all the certificate coming down to the operations and management purpose. Most people think that they might be able to get the certificates whenever they take a configuration backup. No. The configuration backup is not going to have the certificates that you're holding in your deployment. The certificate have to be exported along with the private key for your backup operations. So when is it useful for you? Consider a situation where you are making use of an ISE which was not functioning properly. Then you might have to actually install fresh ISE node, and then you can restore the certificate that you have taken a backup earlier. So coming down to the alarms and notification parts of a piece of it, if you go to the system certificate or certificate management page of an ISE, you would be able to see the status column. The status column indicates whether the certificate is in disabled, active, or is it having any expiry period, or is it even a stale certificate that it is being used or as an expired one. Disabled means the certificate is no longer being used in your deployment. Warning means it might be getting expired sooner. Once it is get expired, you're going to see this status as expired. The stale one is not functioning or the chain was broken. The certificate chain was broken. So we do have an alarms notification in case of expiry coming to the expiry notification, or they already expired, or even if they were having any stale certificate which are not trusted. Let's take an example. I got one alarm notification over here stating that I'm having a certificate expiration. If you look at, click on those alarm details, you're going to clearly see that the certificate being used in this node is coming down to the expiry. We do have open APIs for you to do a certificate management. Whatever the operations that I talked now, you can make use of open APIs for you to manage the certificate operations. Remember, we recently announced 3.1 as a recommended release, and in 3.1 we do have open APIs for you to manage all the certificate operations. Especially from a 3.1 patch 1 standpoint, we introduced the self-signed certificate management also. So you can make use of these open APIs for your certificate operations in the deployment and automation purposes. So now that's what I wanted to cover for today. Any open question, Rico?
Thank you, Pawan. Great presentation. I'm looking at our Q&A here, and it looks like we have no outstanding questions. No, actually, sorry, I spoke too soon. There is one question here remaining. And this question is it possible to export multiple certs, or do you have to export one by one?
You have to export it one by one. Because when you're trying to export the certificate, you have a choice of exporting the certificate only with a public key and a PEM format, or even public key and a private key, both of them. So it is better to it is allowing you to export this certificate one by one. Remember this one, you might not be having a huge number of system certificates. That's where your operations come into play, where whether you want to make use of one certificate for all the services, or wildcard certificate for the smoother operations, or even different certificate for different purposes altogether. In any situation, you might not be having huge number of certificate in your system store. You can export the certificates individually.